On the 6th of April 1965, the Chancellor of the Exchequer rose in the House of Commons and cancelled Britain's most advanced aircraft in 4 sentences. No committee hearing, no parliamentary debate, no vote. James Callaghan buried the TSR-2 inside a budget statement between a tobacco duty adjustment and a note on corporation tax. The program had consumed £195 million. 1 aircraft had already flown. 11 more were on order. Within 6 weeks, the order came through to destroy the airframes. Not mothball them, not place them in storage against future need. Destroy them. Engineers who had spent a decade of their working lives on the program watched angle grinders cut into wings that had never seen combat. At Shoeburyness, XR-222, a complete flight-ready TSR-2 was used as a ground target for weapons testing. The airframe did not survive the exercise. 3 years later, the aircraft Britain had been promised as a replacement. The American F-111K was cancelled in turn by the United States. Britain received no aircraft, no refund, and no apology. The RAF filled the gap with the Buccaneer, a naval strike aircraft designed for carrier decks pressed into land-based service because nothing else existed. The supersonic strike jet that British engineers had spent 8 years building, at a cost that would exceed £2.5 billion in today's money, had been replaced by nothing. But the real story of the TSR-2 is not the cancellation, and it is not the destruction of the airframes. It is the story of what happens when the most capable aircraft a nation has ever designed meets a treasury that cannot afford it, an American ally that does not want it to exist, and a government that must choose between the two. In the autumn of 1956, 2 events changed the direction of British air power simultaneously. The first was Suez. In October of that year, RAF English Electric Canberras flew strike missions over Egypt in support of the Anglo-French operation to retake the Suez Canal. The Canberra was a fine aircraft. It had entered service in 1951 as Britain's first jet bomber, and it remained capable by the standards of its era. But over Suez, its limitations were unmistakable. It flew subsonic. It carried conventional bombs on fixed pylons. It had no terrain-following capability, no ability to drop to low level and use the Earth itself as a shield against radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. Against Egypt's Soviet-supplied air defenses in 1956, those limitations were manageable. Against the Soviet Union's air defense network across Central Europe, they would be fatal. The second event was the Soviet Union's first operational deployment of the S-75 Dvina, known in the West as the SA-2 guideline, a radar-guided surface-to-air missile system capable of engaging targets at altitudes up to 60,000 feet. The high-altitude strike mission, which had been the RAF's primary doctrine since the end of the Second World War, was now compromised. Any aircraft that flew high and slow over Soviet-controlled territory was, in the blunt assessment of Air Ministry planners, already dead. The requirement that emerged from those 2 realizations was extraordinary in its ambition. Air Staff Requirement 343, issued formally in 1957, called for a single aircraft that could do everything the RAF needed and nothing the RAF already had could deliver. It had to fly at Mach 2.0 at altitude, twice the speed of sound, roughly 1,320 miles per hour. It had to fly at Mach 1.1 at low level, supersonic below 1,000 feet, where the air is dense enough to tear conventional airframes apart. It had to carry a nuclear weapon into the Soviet heartland without fighter escort, navigating by internal systems alone in all weathers by day or by night, and it had to be able to land on grass strips, forward operating bases that had not yet been built, in a European war that had not yet started. No aircraft in the world could do all of those things in 1957. The specification was not a description of a known technology. It was a demand that British industry invent one. The contract to attempt it went to Vickers Armstrongs and English Electric, 2 companies that had never previously worked together and were, in several respects, institutional rivals. Vickers, headquartered at Weybridge in Surrey, had built the Valiant, the first of the V-Force nuclear bombers. English Electric, operating from Wharton in Lancashire, had produced the Canberra and was mid-development on the Lightning Interceptor. Neither company alone had the capacity to meet ASR 343. Together, they formed the British Aircraft Corporation, BAC, in 1960, a forced merger that Whitehall had made a condition of the contract. The development award, signed in 1959, was valued at £90 million, approximately £2.3 billion at current prices. The men who would actually design the aircraft were not executives. They were engineers who had spent careers inside the specific problems that ASR-343 demanded they solve. At Vickers, the chief designer was Ernest Marshall. At English Electric, the technical lead was Freddie Page, the same Freddie Page who had overseen the Lightning's development and who understood, better than almost anyone in British aviation, what supersonic flight at low level actually did to an airframe. Page had watched Lightning test aircraft suffer structural fatigue from sustained high-speed runs at medium altitude. He knew that what ASR-343 was asking for at low level was structurally a different problem from anything either company had previously attempted. 6 design teams submitted proposals in response to ASR-343. Hawker Aircraft proposed a development of their P1121 concept. Blackburn submitted a naval-oriented design. De Havilland entered a proposal based on their experience with the Blue Streak missile program. All 3 were eliminated in the first evaluation round. The requirement was too demanding, the integration too complex, and the political decision, already forming in Whitehall, was that the contract would consolidate British aviation rather than fragment it further. BAC's proposal won. The aircraft was designated TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance Mark II, the Mark I designation having been reserved for a development study that never progressed. First metal was cut at Weybridge in 1961. The prototype, serial number XR219, began assembly the same year. The program that would consume the next 4 years and ultimately the careers and reputations of everyone connected to it had begun. The TSR-2 was not a refinement of what came before it, it was a discontinuity. Every major British combat aircraft of the post-war era had been built around a single primary mission. The Canberra bombed, the Lightning intercepted, the Vulcan delivered nuclear weapons from altitude. The TSR-2 was required to do all 3 simultaneously, and to do each of them better than the aircraft that had been designed specifically for that purpose, alone. The engineering decisions that followed from that requirement were, in several cases, without precedent in British aviation. Begin with the airframe itself. The TSR-2 was 89 feet long, roughly the length of 8 London double-decker buses placed end-to-end. Its wingspan measured 37 feet. Those proportions were deliberate, a long, narrow body to minimize frontal area and reduce aerodynamic drag at supersonic speed, and a short, stiff wing to resist the violent buffeting that low-level supersonic flight imposes on every surface. At high speed and low altitude, the air is not smooth. It is turbulent, dense, and punishing. Conventional wings flex under those conditions. The TSR-2's wing was designed to resist that flex, machined from solid aluminum alloy billets rather than built up from sheet metal, giving each panel a structural integrity that no comparable British airframe had previously achieved. The engines were 2 Bristol Siddeley Olympus 320 turbojets, a military development of the same Olympus family that would later power Concorde. Each engine produced 30,610 pounds of thrust in reheat, that is, with afterburner engaged, injecting additional fuel directly into the exhaust stream to produce a controlled explosion that drives the aircraft beyond the speed of sound. Combined, the 2 Olympus 320s gave the TSR-2 a total installed thrust greater than any other aircraft in RAF service at the time. They also gave it a takeoff run short enough to operate from unprepared grass strips, a requirement that had seemed, when first written into ASR-343, essentially contradictory with supersonic performance. The engineers solved it with a thrust-to-weight ratio that, at combat weight, exceeded 0.7, meaning the aircraft could accelerate vertically if the situation demanded it, though it was never intended to do so. The navigation and attack system was, by the standards of 1963, a generation ahead of anything flying in Western Air Forces. At its core was a forward-looking terrain-following radar, a system that scanned the ground ahead of the aircraft and fed continuous altitude data to an autopilot, allowing the TSR-2 to fly at 200 feet above the ground at 600 miles per hour in complete darkness, without the pilot making a single manual control input. Terrain-following radar, then where the aircraft's nose-mounted radar reads the shape of the ground ahead and the autopilot adjusts pitch and roll to follow the contours automatically, keeping the aircraft at a fixed height regardless of hills, valleys, or obstructions, had been demonstrated in experimental form by other programs. The TSR-2 was the first British aircraft designed from the outset to use it operationally at supersonic speed, in a combat environment where the consequences of failure were measured in milliseconds. Alongside the terrain-following system sat an inertial navigation platform, a gyroscope-based positioning system requiring no external radio signal that calculated the aircraft's position continuously from the moment of engine start. Inertial navigation, where a precisely calibrated set of gyroscopes and accelerometers tracks every movement of the aircraft and integrates that data into a continuously updated position fix, independent of any ground-based transmitter or satellite, was a critical capability in a European war scenario where Soviet electronic warfare would almost certainly deny conventional radio navigation within the first hours of conflict. The TSR-2 system was accurate to approximately 1 nautical mile after an hour of flight, a figure that sounds modest against later technology, but represented a significant operational advance over anything then in RAF squadron service. The weapons bay was buried internally, a design decision that reduced radar cross-section, the measurement of how large an object appears on an enemy radar screen, by eliminating the external pylons and bomb shapes that, on aircraft like the Canberra, acted as radar reflectors and announced the aircraft's presence across hundreds of miles. Internal carriage also reduced aerodynamic drag at high speed, extending range and reducing fuel consumption during the critical low-level penetration phase of a nuclear strike mission. The specified weapon load included the WE-177 nuclear bomb, Britain's tactical nuclear weapon of the era, as well as conventional bombs, reconnaissance cameras, and a side-looking airborne radar for post-strike damage assessment. The aircraft could, in a single sortie, strike a target, photograph the result, and return navigational data sufficient to plan a follow-on mission. No other aircraft in the RAF inventory could do any one of those things as effectively. No other aircraft in any air force could do all of them together. The test program began at Boscombe Down, Wiltshire, on 27th of September 1964, when XR-219, the first prototype, made its maiden flight with Roland Beaumont at the controls. Beaumont was not a young man given his first important task. He was 45 years old, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, a Hawker Typhoon wing commander from the Second World War, and the man who had first flown the Canberra and the Lightning. He understood British aviation's capabilities and its limits better than almost anyone alive. His assessment of the TSR-2 after that first flight was measured and precise. The aircraft handled well, the systems were complex, and the program needed time. Time was the one thing it would not be given. Boscombe Down recorded 24 test flights before the cancellation order arrived. In those 24 sorties, XR-219 reached Mach 0.9, just below the speed of sound, at low level, demonstrated stable handling across its intended flight envelope, and validated the basic aerodynamic predictions that the BAC team had spent 3 years calculating. The terrain-following radar and the inertial navigation system were not yet integrated at the point of cancellation. Those systems were scheduled for the second and third prototypes. But the airframe flew, the engines ran, the fundamental engineering was sound. The political machinery, by contrast, was already failing. By the end of 1964, the unit cost of the TSR-2 had risen from the original estimate of £1.75 million per aircraft, the figure quoted to the Air Ministry at contract award, to a projected figure somewhere between £3 million and £7.5 million per airframe, depending on which set of Treasury assumptions was applied and how many aircraft were ultimately ordered. The range itself was an indictment. A program that could not produce a cost estimate narrower than £4 million per unit was a program that had lost control of its own numbers. The Treasury had noticed, so had the new government. The TSR-2 never entered service. That fact is central to understanding what this section of its history actually is, not a combat record, but a capability record, a documentation of what the aircraft could do, what it was designed to deter, and what the RAF lost when the program ended. To understand the scale of that loss, it is necessary to understand what NATO's Central Front looked like in 1964. The Soviet Union's ground forces in East Germany numbered approximately 380,000 troops, organized into 20 divisions, supported by tactical nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and the most dense concentration of surface-to-air missile batteries ever assembled in peacetime. Behind them, stretching east across Poland and into the Soviet Union itself, lay the command nodes, supply depots, railway junctions, airfields, and communication centers that sustained that force. NATO's strategy, as codified in MC 14/3, the Alliance's formal military doctrine, required the ability to strike those targets deep inside Warsaw Pact territory, rapidly, accurately, and if necessary with nuclear weapons, in the opening hours of a conflict before Soviet forces could consolidate their position. The RAF's assigned role within that strategy was deep interdiction, flying beneath Soviet radar coverage at low level and high speed to destroy the infrastructure that kept the Red Army moving westward. The aircraft assigned to that role in 1964 was the Canberra, which had been in service since 1951 and which, against the SA-2 missile systems now deployed across Eastern Europe, had a life expectancy in combat measured in single-figure minutes. The TSR-2 was the answer to that problem. At Mach 1.1 at 200 feet, it was faster than any Soviet interceptor could engage at low level. At 200 feet above the ground, it was below the effective engagement envelope of every surface-to-air missile system the Warsaw Pact then operated. Its internal navigation system required no radio transmission that Soviet electronic warfare could detect or jam. And its internal weapons bay meant it carried no external signature that radar could identify as a strike aircraft rather than background noise. The RAF's planned order was 158 aircraft. At peak production, BAC's facilities at Weybridge and Preston were projected to sustain a build rate of 3 airframes per month, employing directly or indirectly an estimated 40,000 workers across Lancashire, Surrey, and the Bristol area. The subcontractor network extended further still. Ferranti in Edinburgh supplying the navigation systems, Elliott Brothers in Rochester developing the autopilot, Hunting Engineering at Luton working on the weapons release system. The TSR-2 was not merely an aircraft program, it was a regional industrial structure, and its cancellation would be felt in factory towns that had no connection to Whitehall and no voice in the decision. The planned operational deployment, had the program proceeded, called for the TSR-2 to equip 6 RAF strike squadrons on the Central European Front. The specific squadrons identified in Air Ministry planning documents included No. 9 Squadron based at RAF Honington in Suffolk, a unit with a continuous bombing role stretching back to 1914. No. 12 Squadron, also at Honington, which had operated the Buccaneer in the maritime strike role and was scheduled for conversion. No. 15 Squadron at RAF Cottesmore in Rutland, a Canberra unit earmarked for re-equipment. No. 16 Squadron, then flying Canberras from RAF Larbruch in West Germany, directly on the Central Front. No. 27 Squadron at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, a V4 support unit with nuclear delivery experience. And No. 45 Squadron, based in the Far East Air Force, for operations across the confrontation theater in Borneo and Malaysia, a conflict then actively underway, in which low-level strike capability was not a Cold War abstraction, but an immediate operational requirement. Overseas interest extended beyond the RAF. The Royal Australian Air Force evaluated the TSR-2 formally as a replacement for their aging Canberra fleet. Australia had operated the Canberra since 1953 and was under pressure from the same threat environment. Soviet-supplied aircraft and missile systems spreading through Southeast Asia that drove the RAF's own requirement. BAC records indicate that Australia considered an order of between 24 and 36 aircraft. Canada conducted a less formal assessment. West Germany, constrained by post-war treaty limitations on offensive aircraft, observed the program with interest without committing to evaluation. The export potential was real. It was also irrelevant to what happened next. The first signs of structural difficulty had appeared before the aircraft ever flew. In 1963, the Public Accounts Committee received evidence that the development cost estimate, originally set at £90 million at contract signature in 1959, had already grown to £175 million, an increase of 94% in 4 years before a single production aircraft had been delivered. The PSC's report was careful and precise in its language. It noted that the complexity of the requirement had been underestimated at the outset, that the decision to develop so many advanced systems simultaneously rather than sequentially had compounded risk across every major subsystem, and that the contracted price structure had given BAC insufficient incentive to control costs within agreed limits. The Ministry of Aviation's response was to commission a further review. The Treasury's response was to begin preparing alternatives. By January 1964, private correspondence between the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury and the Minister of Aviation, now partially available through the National Archives at Kew under AVIA series references, indicates that cancellation was already under active consideration more than a year before it occurred and while the aircraft was still being assembled. The argument was not primarily technical. The TSR-2's engineering was not in serious dispute. The argument was financial, and it was unanswerable on the Treasury's own terms. A program whose unit cost could not be reliably estimated could not be reliably budgeted, and a government already under balance of payments pressure could not commit to an open-ended procurement at the scale the RAF required. In October 1964, Harold Wilson's Labor government won the general election with a majority of 4 seats. The new government inherited a defense budget that consumed 7% of gross domestic product, a proportion that the Treasury regarded as structurally unsustainable, and a TSR-2 program whose total cost, by the most pessimistic internal projections, might reach £750 million before the last aircraft was delivered. The Treasury began its final calculation. The aircraft's days were already numbered. The Wilson government did not arrive in office intending to cancel the TSR-2. That point is worth establishing clearly because the cancellation is sometimes presented as an ideological act, a Labor government disposing of a prestige military program on principle. The reality was more complicated and in some respects more damning. In the first months after the October 1964 election, the new government commissioned its own review of the TSR-2's costs and prospects. The review was led by Lord Mountbatten, then Chief of the Defense Staff, and by the newly appointed Minister of Defense, Dennis Healey. Healey was not a man given to sentiment about defense procurement. He was an Oxford-educated former Army officer with a background in defense policy analysis, and he approached the TSR-2 question with the same methodical skepticism he brought to every inherited program. His conclusion, reached by early 1965, was that the aircraft itself was technically sound. The program, however, was not. The cost projections had continued to move. By February 1965, the estimated cost per production aircraft had risen to a figure that BAC itself could not precisely specify, a range of between £3.5 million and £7.5 million per airframe, depending on the final order quantity, with the unit cost falling only if the government committed to the full 158 aircraft order. The Treasury's position was that committing to 158 aircraft at an unresolved unit cost was not a procurement decision. It was a blank check. There was a second dimension to the calculation, and it came from Washington. The United States government, under both the Johnson administration and its predecessor, had been pressing Britain to purchase the General Dynamics F-111, an American variable geometry strike aircraft then under development for the U.S. Air Force. The F-111K, as the British variant was designated, was offered at a fixed unit price of approximately £2 million per aircraft, substantially below even the most optimistic TSR-2 projection. The American offer was framed as an act of alliance solidarity. The PREM-13 files at the National Archives, declassified in subsequent decades, indicate that it was accompanied by pressure that went considerably beyond a commercial proposition. British purchase of the F-111K was linked, in American thinking, to continued U.S. support for sterling on international currency markets, a connection that the Wilson government, facing a chronic balance of payments deficit and the constant threat of a sterling devaluation, could not ignore. The precise nature of that linkage remains contested among historians. What is not contested is the sequence of events. In March 1965, Dennis Healey presented the Cabinet with a formal recommendation to cancel the TSR-2 and order the F-111K as a replacement. The Cabinet accepted the recommendation. The decision was not announced to Parliament. It was not debated in committee. It was placed inside the budget statement of 6th of April 1965 as a single line item on the grounds that the financial implications of the cancellation made it appropriately a Treasury matter. At BAC's facilities at Weybridge, the workforce learned of the cancellation from a radio news bulletin. The contractor's response was immediate and ultimately futile. BAC's chairman, Lord Caldecott, wrote to the Minister of Aviation within 48 hours of the budget statement, arguing that the program could be restructured, the cost contained, and the order reduced to a viable minimum of 80 aircraft without compromising the RAF's operational requirement. The letter received a formal acknowledgement. It received no substantive reply. An export campaign was hastily assembled. BAC approached the Royal Australian Air Force directly, proposing that Australia underwrite continued development in exchange for a guaranteed supply contract. Australia declined. The RAAF had already begun its own assessment of the F-111 as a replacement for its Canberras, an assessment that would itself become one of the most troubled procurement episodes in Australian defence history, with the aircraft not delivered until 1973, 8 years late and at more than double the contracted price. But that was in the future. In April 1965, Australia's decision removed the last realistic possibility of keeping the TSR-2 program alive through export orders. The workforce reductions began in May 1965. Then the destruction order arrived. The instruction to render the TSR-2 airframes unusable came from the Ministry of Aviation. The stated rationale was that the aircraft incorporated classified technology that could not be allowed to pass into foreign hands through sale or transfer. There were 9 completed or near-completed airframes. 2 were preserved, XR-219, the first prototype which survives at the RAF Museum Cosford in Shropshire, and XR-222, which eventually reached the Imperial War Museum at Duxford in Cambridgeshire after being used as a ground weapons target at Shoeburyness. The remaining airframes were scrapped. The jigs were broken up. The production tooling was destroyed. The specialist workforce dispersed. Ferranti's navigation team was reassigned. Elliott Brothers' autopilot division lost its contract. The BAC facilities at Weybridge began redundancy consultations. 40,000 jobs across the supply chain entered uncertainty. The F111K order was placed. 3 years passed. In January 1968, the United States canceled the F111K. Britain received no aircraft. No compensation was paid. No alternative was offered. The RAF continued to fly the Canberra. The TSR-2 has been dead for 60 years. Its influence has not. The technologies developed under the program did not disappear when the airframes were scrapped. They dispersed into research establishments, into successor programs, into the institutional memory of the engineers who had built them and who went on to build other things. Tracing that dispersal is not a sentimental exercise. It is a procurement history with measurable consequences. The terrain-following radar system developed by Texas Instruments under contract to BAC and refined through the TSR-2's test program became the direct technical ancestor of the system fitted to the Panavia Tornado GR-1. The Tornado, developed jointly by Britain, West Germany, and Italy through the multi-role combat aircraft program, with BAC as the British industrial lead, entered RAF service in 1982. It carried a terrain-following radar that owed its conceptual architecture, its operational parameters, and several of its core design assumptions to work originally done for the TSR-2. The Tornado flew the low-level supersonic penetration missions over Iraq in 1991 that the TSR-2 had been designed in 1957 to fly over the Soviet Union. The thread between them was unbroken, even if the aircraft were separated by 17 years and the collapse of an entire industrial generation. The inertial navigation platform developed by Ferranti in Edinburgh fed directly into the navigation systems of the Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft and, in refined form, into the Tornado's own nav attack suite. Ferranti's Edinburgh division survived the TSR-2 cancellation and continued as a major supplier of airborne navigation equipment to the RAF and Royal Navy for the following 3 decades. A continuity of capability that might not have existed had the TSR-2 never been contracted in the first place. The forced merger that produced British Aircraft Corporation in 1960, a condition imposed by Whitehall as a prerequisite for the TSR-2 contract, permanently restructured British aviation. BAC absorbed Vickers, English Electric Aviation, and the Bristol Aeroplane Company. It became British Aerospace in 1977 through a further round of government-directed consolidation. British Aerospace became BAE Systems in 1999, the company that today builds the Typhoon fighter, the Hawk trainer, and the Type 26 frigate for the Royal Navy traces its direct corporate lineage to the merger that Whitehall demanded as the price of the TSR-2 contract. The program that was cancelled created the industrial structure that British defense still depends upon. The capability gap, however, was real and it was long. Between April 1965 and the Tornado GR-1's declaration of operational capability with No. 9 Squadron at RAF Honington in June 1982, the RAF operated without a credible supersonic low-level strike aircraft capable of deep penetration into defended airspace. The Buccaneer, which filled the gap in the interim, was an exceptional aircraft, robust, reliable, and genuinely capable in the maritime strike role for which it had been designed. But it was subsonic at low level. It lacked the TSR-2's navigation precision, and it had been designed for carrier operations, not Central European warfighting. The crews who flew it knew its limitations. So did the Soviet air defense planners who tracked it on exercise. 17 years is not a gap. It is a generation of operational capability surrendered. Now the human footnote, and it is a remarkable one. Roland Beaumont, who flew XR-219 on its maiden flight on September 27, 1964, did not speak publicly about the TSR-2 cancellation for many years after the event. When he did, his assessments were characteristically precise. He noted, in interviews and in his written accounts of the program published in subsequent decades, that the aircraft he flew on those 24 test sorties was not a finished weapon system. It was a prototype with significant development work still ahead of it, but he was equally clear that the fundamental engineering was not in question. The aircraft flew where it was supposed to fly. It went where it was pointed. The systems that were installed and tested behaved as the calculations predicted they would behave. Beaumont continued flying until well into his later years. He died in November 2001 at the age of 82. He had first flown in combat in 1940 over Dunkirk in a Hawker Hurricane. He had last flown the TSR-2 in December 1964, 4 months before the cancellation. In between, he had made the first flights of the Canberra, the Lightning, and the TSR-2, 3 of the most significant British combat aircraft of the post-war era. He regarded the TSR-2's cancellation, by the account of those who knew him, as the single most consequential institutional failure of his professional lifetime. He did not say so in those terms publicly. He was too precise a man for imprecision of that kind. What the procurement historians say is less restrained. The assessments that have accumulated across the decades in the work of researchers with access to the Avia and Prem series files at the National Archives, in the analysis produced by the Royal United Services Institute, in the evidence submitted to successive Public Accounts Committee inquiries into defense procurement, converge on a consistent verdict. The TSR-2 was not cancelled because it failed. It was cancelled because it succeeded at a cost that a government under acute financial pressure could not sustain, and because an allied power with a competing product applied pressure at the moment of maximum British vulnerability. The replacement that justified the cancellation never arrived. The capability gap that resulted lasted nearly 2 decades, and the total cost of the gap, measured in the Buccaneer conversions, the interim procurement decisions, and the accelerated entry into the MRCA program that eventually produced the Tornado, likely exceeded the cost of completing the TSR-2 in the first place. That calculation was never made officially. It remains, in the precise language of the procurement record, an unquantified liability. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It is the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the aircraft, the ships, and the decisions that shape British military power, subscribe to UK Defence Archive. We will see you in the next one. At RAF Museum Cosford, in a hangar shared with the Victor and the Vulcan, XR-219 sits on static display behind a rope barrier, its Olympus engines cold, its terrain-following radar housing empty, its cockpit sealed. It is pointed, as it always was, toward the east, toward the low-level corridors over Central Europe that it was built to fly, at Mach 1.1, at 200 feet, in the dark, against a threat that no longer exists and an order that never came.